Due to the nature of Dead by Daylight being an asymmetrical horror game, imbalance is definitely something that's always going to be apparent in the game, but with that said, behavior themselves have shown that they like to keep the game fresh and interesting by changing up the meta, and popular perks have had minor to significant nerfs and buffs over the years, as well as killer powers and even maps as well. Today we're going to be going over 5 different killers that need a buff and 5 different killers that need a nerf. Of course, this is 100% my opinion, so feel free to let me know in the comments down below some killers that you would like to see nerfed and some killers that you would like to see buffed. But with all that said, let's get into the list. So starting off with the killers that I would personally nerf, and very first on the list is Skull Merchant. Skull Merchant did recently receive a rework that somewhat addressed her ability to hold down a 3-gen extremely well, with many Skull Merchants being able to hold the survivors hostage, whilst the game would last up to an entire 60 minutes. Although she has already had a recent rework, she still remains one of the most hated killers in the entire game, due to her ability to put healthy survivors into the deep wound effect completely free just by using her drones. Oftentimes there's absolutely nothing that the survivor can do to prevent this, if you are in chase and being pushed towards the drones. This killer is one that I'm unsure how behavior would go about nerfing. Perhaps further limiting the amount of drones she can have active at one specific time could be a solution, but let me know in the comments down below what ideas you guys have of nerfing the Skull Merchant. Let me know exactly what the reason is that you hate playing against her, and let me know what your solution to that would be. A killer that has remained top dog in Dead by Daylight since the very early days is the Nurse. The Nurse is the only killer in the game that completely negates the 2 different tools that the survivors have to use whilst in chase. That of course being both windows and pallets. Her ability to teleport through walls and directly towards survivors makes both of these means almost completely useless against her, resulting in the survivors instead having to break line of sight in an attempt to evade her in chase. I would definitely love to see behavior change up the #1 spot in terms of killer strength, so for this reason I think we are long overdue a significant nerf to the Nurse. My idea for giving the Nurse a huge nerf would be limiting her power to 1 single blink. Of course, this seems like it would completely destroy her, to which I would agree if we only did that, so I would also buff her in other areas to prevent her from being completely unusable. One example would be to slightly increase her movement speed. The Nurse currently moves at just 96.25%, making her the only killer in the game who's actually slower than the survivors. Obviously, making her base movement speed 115%, like the majority of M1 killers, would certainly be overkill, but maybe making her 100%, making her the same speed as survivors, or even 105% or 110%, much like the Huntress. Another thing they could do is reduce the fatigue from blinking. If she now only had 1 blink, reducing the base fatigue time definitely wouldn't be out of the question. This one may be a controversial pick, as limiting her to just 1 blink definitely would be a significant nerf, but with all the time spent at the top of the list in terms of killer power, a new #1 killer definitely would be a welcome change for many, and as previously stated, they could also play around with the idea of buffing the fatigue and or movement speed to prevent her from being completely unplayable, potentially even having a second blink now locked behind an iridescent add-on instead of removing it completely. Either way, I definitely think this would be a huge change, and one that would take a PTB as well as a couple of different updates to find the right balance of a significant nerf without completely ruining her. Another killer who has been one of the strongest killers in the game since their release back in 2020 is the Blight. The Blight, much like Nurse, is extremely strong in comparison to other killers, with a skilled Blight being able to destroy most survivor teams with absolute ease. Despite having many changes and nerfs to specific add-ons, his base power is yet to receive a significant nerf. A recent change they made to his base power was limiting his ability to hug tech, which is basically where the killer slides around a certain loop in order to spin up to 180 degrees, allowing him to get impressive hits on the survivor. But I definitely wouldn't consider this a huge nerf to his base power, since he still has exceptional map mobility and can still end chases in just seconds. An idea that I have to nerf the Blight would be very similar to nerfing the Nurse. Instead of blinks, the Blight has rushes, with his base power allowing him to perform 5 separate rushes, but perhaps limiting this to just 3 rushes instead of 5 would be a fair way to nerf him without completely making him unplayable. I think this would be a much better way of nerfing the Blight more consistently, rather than just changing certain add-ons. As stated earlier, the Blight along with the Nurse have been the 2 strongest killers in the game for many years now, with each of these killers being at least 1 tier above any other killer in the game. This being the main reason as to why I think both killers are long overdue a significant nerf, allowing other killers to finally take the spotlight for the strongest killers in the game. Chucky is a killer that has received many different tweaks to his power. Personally, my main issue with Chucky is that he's so small, not only making this inaccurate in terms of how he looks in the movies, but it also makes him extremely unfun to play against, as you can almost never see exactly where he is. The fact that his power also suppresses the terror radius further adds to the struggle of being able to see exactly where he is, which can make him an extremely frustrating killer to play against. An obvious change for Chucky would be to increase his height, fixing most of his issues and also making him more accurate to the movies. However, this would definitely take a lot of work, and it's also something something I'm not even sure behavior would be permitted to do, since he is a licensed killer. One idea that I had as far back as when Chucky was first released was to somehow lift up the red glow, adding some height to the killer without actually changing the model itself. This does have a couple of issues, however. I'm not sure exactly how easy this would be for behavior to implement, or if it would even be possible at all. Another issue with this change would be that it wouldn't work whilst Chucky's in his hidey-ho mode, due to him being completely undetectable. As much as I love Chucky as a horror character, his addition to the Dead by Daylight roster hasn't been one that I enjoyed playing against. As stated earlier, his lack of height combined with the fact his power allows him to go completely undetectable makes for a very frustrating experience overall when playing against him. Let me know if you guys agree, or let me know if you guys actually enjoy playing against Chucky. Also, if you do agree that he needs a nerf, let me know what ideas you guys have to fix these issues. The newest killer that has been added to Dead by Daylight at the time of recording this video is the Lich. Upon his addition to the DBD roster, the Lich is easily one of my favorite killers in the game, and I definitely don't think the Lich is overpowered in any way, just very difficult to counter and chase if his power is used correctly. So for this reason, I would just give him a very slight nerf to the Mage Hand ability. On paper, the Mage Hand definitely doesn't seem that strong, especially since lifting up a pallet allows the survivors to reuse that pallet again later. However, this allows him to completely negate the use of God pallets, often catching up to the survivor and either injuring or downing the survivor in just seconds after they drop the God pallet. There is a very good way to counter this, however. The Lich spawns in chests around the map, which allow the survivors to roll a dice and receive a random power that they can use throughout the trial. One of these powers is the ability to gain haste whenever the Lich uses his Mage Hand ability. This will often allow you to do an extra loop around the pallet or move to a completely different loop entirely, making it to safety. This makes his Mage Hand ability much less efficient on any survivor who's currently using this power. So my idea for nerfing the Lich could even be considered a buff in certain scenarios. I would completely remove the ability to gain haste from the chest whenever the Lich uses his Mage Hand ability. Instead, you could get to see his aura for a few seconds whenever he uses Mage Hand. There are already a couple of different powers that you can obtain through the chest that do allow you to see his aura, but perhaps this one could be 3 to 4 seconds, which would allow you to see if he doubles back at certain loops. And also, because we are taking away the haste ability from this power up, the way I would nerf the Lich is slowing him down for an extra 0.5 seconds or so whenever he uses Mage Hand ability, and I think this could be a good solution. Obviously, they would have to play around with how long he gets slowed for after using Mage Hand, but this would definitely balance out his Mage Hand ability overall, making it so that survivors are no longer dependent on using a certain power to counter one of his abilities. So moving on to the killers that I personally think need a buff, and the first of which being Myers. Myers is a killer who is extremely outdated and long overdue a buff. Myers with his best add-ons and a solid build can be a pretty strong killer overall, but his dependency on add-ons is what ruins Myers for many people. In my opinion, Myers is the most add-on dependent killer in the entire game, and if we're talking about base kit alone and excluding add-ons, I would say he is the weakest in the game. I have two different ideas for ways they could buff Myers, the first of which would be to balance his add-ons into his base kit. For example, Judas Journal allows him to gain 40% increase when stalking the Obsession. They could change his add-on down to just 20% and include the other 20% into his base kit. There's also another add-on called J. Myers Memorial, which increases your stalk rate on all survivors by 25%. Perhaps they could add 10% to his base kit and then change this add-on to an additional 15%. Reworking the add-ons into the base kit is something they've recently done with Leatherface, so I definitely think Myers could also benefit from this change. Whilst these changes wouldn't necessarily make him stronger, since it would be the exact same using those two add-ons, this would definitely address the issue of his base kit being so weak, giving it a much needed buff and making him much less add-on dependent. Another idea that I have for ways they could buff Myers would be to remove his tier 1 ability. Starting out in tier 1 makes his early game extremely tedious, and against a good team of survivors, Myers can have a very slow start to the game. So my idea for removing tier 1 from his base kit would mean that he obviously starts the game out in tier 2. One issue with this is that his Scratch Mirror add-on would now be completely unusable, as this add-on requires you to stay in tier 1 for the entire game, which is why they should still keep his tier 1 ability in the game, but now it would be exclusive to this add-on instead. The Scratch Mirror add-on is an extremely fun and scary way to play Myers, which is why I would definitely keep the possibility of tier 1 open and locked exclusively to this add-on. Freddy is a killer who's been at both ends of the killer tier list. In his very early days, Freddy was by far the weakest killer in the game. Due to his power, you had to drag survivors into the dream world before injuring them. This basically meant that you had to hit a survivor 3 times in order to down them, since you had to be somewhat close to them and wait a few seconds for them to be dragged into the dream world. He has also been up there as one of the strongest killers in the game. Whilst not on the same level of the likes of Nurse or Blight, in 2019, Freddy was easily one of the top 5 killers in the entire game. Back then, Freddy had 2 different add-ons that would slow down generator speed, the first of which being the add-on jump rope, and the second of which being the add-on swing chains. These add-ons have since received significant nerfs, resulting in them being much weaker overall. In 2021, Freddy received a huge nerf, nerfing not only these two add-ons, but also his base kit, which allowed him to only set up to 5 snares, rather than 8 snares, which was the case before the nerf, as well as several other nerfs to his base kit and add-ons. Freddy is a killer that has gone completely unchanged since then, with the exception of his Z-block add-on, recently receiving a small buff. Freddy is also a killer that has been confirmed to be getting a rework at some point in the future. There has been talk about this for a while now, which likely means this isn't high priority for behavior, so who knows when he'll actually receive the rework. I definitely think this rework would be an overall buff to his power and or add-ons, but I do also think they will be very careful with this so they don't buff him too much, because as previously mentioned, Freddy was one of the strongest and most hated killers in the game back in 2019. Freddy does have a few different powers, his first being his whole dream world ability, the second being his ability to teleport to generators that haven't yet been completed, and the third of which being his snares or dream pallets. I would give him several buffs to his base kit. The first thing that I would do is allow him to once again set up to 8 snares. I would also give him some form of generator and or healing slowdown for survivors that are in the dream world, just not to the extent that it was back in 2019. This would definitely give some further incentive for survivors to stay awake, as right now it's not really needed to stay awake. The Clown is a killer that behavior has tried to buff multiple times to make him somewhat stronger. However, despite this, the Clown still remains one of the weakest killers in the entire game. The most recent change they made was giving his base kit 6 bottles rather than just 4. And the other change that they made a while back was granting the Clown an additional bottle. This new bottle would now give not only the Clown but also the survivor haste whenever they step into the radius of the gas from the bottle. There's 2 obvious issues with this, however. The first of which being the fact that this haste ability also helps out the survivors, and the fact that both the haste and intoxication bottles both share the same number of bottles available to use. One idea that I have is to make it so the haste bottles and intoxication bottles now have their own separate bottles available, meaning that the Clown would have 12 bottles in total, 6 intoxication bottles and 6 haste bottles. Perhaps this would be too much though, and if this was the case, they could give him a total of 10 bottles with 5 of each. This is also something they'd likely need to test out with a PTB. Many Clown players often avoid using the haste bottles entirely due to the intoxication bottles being much more efficient to use in chase, so allowing the haste bottles to have their own amount of bottles available would allow Clown players to experiment more with using the haste bottles. Another idea I have is making it so the haste bottles now only grant the Clown haste, rather than both the Clown and the survivor benefiting from the haste effect. Perhaps adding both of these changes would be overkill, and could potentially turn the Clown into an absolute juggernaut in chase, with extra bottles and the ability to gain haste mid-chase, without also giving the haste to the survivors. So this is something that behavior would likely need to dedicate an entire PTB to, just to make sure that they don't buff him to the point where he becomes completely overpowered. The Trapper is another very weak killer that behavior has tried to buff in the past. However, much like the Clown, the Trapper still remains one of the weakest killers in DBD, despite the buff that he has received. The Trapper's recent buff allows him to gain haste for 5 seconds whenever setting a trap. The problem with this is that it's a really inefficient way to play the Trapper, and the most efficient way to play the Trapper is to set up traps around a certain point of the map, waiting for the survivors to move towards that area. Due to the buff encouraging the Trapper to use his traps in chase, this can often lead to a very frustrating experience when playing the Trapper, because this is the exact opposite strategy to setting up the traps on one side of the map and having the survivors move towards them. An idea that I have for buffing the Trapper would be to include his iridescent add-on, the Bloody Coil, into his base kit. This add-on injures any survivor that successfully disarms a trap, and is an add-on that I think would be a great addition to his base kit. And since this add-on would now become part of his base kit, they could rework the add-on to do something completely different. I definitely don't think this would make the Trapper anywhere close to being overpowered, as certain survivors that are comfortable playing injured could just stay injured and continue disarming the traps. I also think this would add an extra layer of strategy when facing the Trapper, since you would have to choose when it's best to ignore his traps and keep the extra health state. Despite still being a fairly new killer releasing only a year ago, the Singularity has been one of the least used killers in the game, and is one that I myself almost never see when playing Survivor. For this reason, I definitely think the Singularity could benefit from a small buff. This would hopefully encourage more players to try him out, and would result in seeing him in our games more often. I'm by no means an expert on the Singularity, having only played him a handful of times myself, and as previously mentioned, I rarely see him in games when I'm playing Survivor. So for this reason, I personally don't have many ideas for ways in which they could buff him. However, one idea that I do have is to make the EMPs spawn in slower, especially since the survivors can already interact with the chest that they spawn in. I definitely think this would make for a much more enjoyable time overall for Singularity players, not having to worry about the cameras being destroyed nearly as often. Since I don't have many ideas for this one myself, I'd love it if you guys could come up with some ideas to buff the Singularity in the comments down below. And also let me know if you guys agree or disagree with any parts of the video. Also feel free to leave your thoughts and suggestions in the comments, and I hope that you've all really enjoyed the video.